Well, welcome to today's lecture. Before I start with the main subject, early Middle High German, a few words on the internal structure of Middle High German as a whole. Unlike the macrostructural periodization which has been established for the history of German as a whole, no canonical model has prevailed for the internal periodization of Middle High German. Most language histories make do with a solution of dividing the 3 centuries of Middle High German into, you guessed it, maybe 3 sub-periods, which results in the following system. Early Middle High German from 1050 to about 1170, Classical Middle High German from 1170 to 1250, and late Middle High German from 1250 to 1350. I will devote the next 3 sessions to each of these Middle High German sub-periods. The common thread between each session will be a presentation of the textual tradition and how this tradition was handled by text producers and text recipients. I went into the fundamental problems of such periodization models last week, and we don't need to go over these again now. But I would like to point out that for the period ranging from 1170 to 1250, I've put the period-defining attribute classical in quotation marks. I'll explain the reason why in the next lecture. But now to the early Middle High German period. From a historical perspective, this first subperiod is characterized by the Great Schism of 1054, the victory of William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, the investiture controversy, and Henry IV's journey to Canossa, or the First Crusade. Of course, these events and people have no direct influence on the development of the German language. The religious reform movements that emanated from the monasteries of Cluny, Hirsau, and Gurs in the 11th century are of greater importance for the history of language and literature of the time. These movements aimed to implement the Benedictine rule in its original strictness for the practice of monastic life. After 1100, out of the same spirit, new orders were founded which followed the same Benedictine rule, the Cistercians and the Premonstratensians. Their monasteries soon became important forces in the economic and cultural life of the surrounding areas. The Cistercians in particular, who as a matter of principle set up their new foundations away from settlement and cities, played a major role in land development and later in the colonization of the East, as did orders that took in lay brothers and lay sisters. How and to what extent did these and other developments affect the attestation of German in the 11th and 12th centuries? Which sources do we rely on for the study of historical linguistics? The following graphic offers an initial overview. I'll explain it a little bit. Only 55 manuscripts contain any German text at all in the 11th century. These differ considerably in their scope. In the graphic, Latin manuscripts that only contain a short German text, such as a prayer or maybe a sermon, are given the same weighting as early Middle High German composite manuscripts which transmit several longer poems. The number doubles in the 12th century, but there is no sudden increase until the 13th century, which no longer falls under the early Middle High German period and will therefore be dealt with only next week. But let's go back to the earlier sources. What kind of texts are we dealing with? Religious texts have been written in the vernacular since the middle of the 11th century. In this respect, nothing has changed since the Old High German period. What changes, however, is the function of these texts. With a few exceptions, the Old High German texts were tools for understanding or developing a Latin text. In early Middle High German, autochthonous German language poems begin to be written. The larger literary Old High German and Old Saxon texts originated in some important monastic centers such as Fulda, Weißenburg, or St. Gallen. They can be linked both directly and indirectly to the cultural and political interests of kings and emperors. At its core was a desire to create a unified Christian people in the empire and to convey the teachings and norms to which people of the empire had to adhere. At various synods and in several decrees of the Carolingian period, for example, it was urged that all inhabitants of the empire should know the core beliefs and master the elementary texts. This was only possible if translations were prepared and made available beforehand. A completely different picture emerges in the early Middle High German period. Text can no longer be assigned to individual literary centers. Divine impulse is no longer the driving factor for authors to put pen to paper. They start to do so of their own accord. However, the literature of the first Middle High German period is still essentially religious literature. So, who were these texts written for? This period not only saw the founding of numerous monasteries, but also the creation of entire religious orders, which led to the emergence of a new group of recipients for spiritual literature. These were lay brothers and nuns who did not speak Latin. But in addition to this, in other lay circles outside the monasteries, there was growing interest in theological questions beyond the elementary minimum instruction that the Carolingian ordinances had already prescribed. The audience who engaged with such material was not just lay brothers and sisters behind monastic walls and lay people outside the monasteries, but those who decided to enter monastic life at a late age. Widowed men and women from aristocratic social classes began to spend their autumn years in the monasteries and often handed over their fortune when doing so. They, too, had to be provided with appropriate reading material. On the other hand, the vernacular literature of the 11th and early 12th centuries was not exactly characteristic of the themes found in the true, so to speak, vernacular. There were no love greetings, no hunts, no battle-hardened heroes. Instead, early Middle High German literature is dominated by poetry, not with the aim of providing pleasure and entertainment, but rather for the salvation of people's souls. The religious literature of early Middle High German has an astonishingly differentiated range of text types, as can be seen in the following synopsis established by Christa Bertelsmeyer-Kierst. Tradition and innovation stand side by side. Late Old High German authors like Notker and Williram continue to be copied well into the 12th century, as were Latin German interlinear translations and small catechetical texts such as Credo and Paternoster. However, the new genre of religious poetry quickly accounts for a considerable portion of the text production of early Middle High German, geistliche Dichtung, religious poetry. The aims of today's lecture are twofold. Firstly, I intend to outline the linguistically relevant conditions in which these texts were created and the factors that influenced them, and secondly, it will be necessary to consider what value these sources offer for the historical linguist. It is not always possible to separate these two perspectives. At times, literary points will be made. I think it's a mistake to believe that historical linguistics and literary studies are two unrelated areas that can be studied in isolation from one another. For the sake of time, however, I will only be able to touch on a small number of sources belonging to four important areas of knowledge. Our first example takes us back to the synoptic overviews, which you just see, which strictly speaking are sort of incomplete. Only the textual tradition is discussed here. Glosses do not get a mention. This is a problem because the gloss tradition provides a very good example of the coexistence of continuity and innovation that is considered characteristic of the early Middle High German period. Glosses are explanations or translations about different words or phrases written around the text of Latin manuscripts. Glosses were common in the European writing cultures of the early and High Middle Ages. As a rule, glosses tended to be in Latin, but for the Old High German period alone, more than 1,500 manuscripts with vernacular glosses survive. Of course, this tradition did not suddenly stop one day when the Middle High German period begins. As a further rule, glossing follows a tradition rather than being spontaneous additions to a given text. Take, for example, the Salomon Glossary, a Latin-to-Latin dictionary widely used in the south of the German-speaking area. 2,500 Old High German glosses had been added to it by the 11th century, and it was subsequently copied several times during the 12th and 13th centuries. Two strategies can be distinguished. The scribe of the Zwetel manuscript from the last third of the 12th century adopted the old High German forms as they were found written, without any adaptation to the contemporary form of German which he spoke. The scribes of the Munich manuscripts before 1165, on the other hand, modernized the language of the original. The difference in the two approaches becomes particularly clear in how unstressed syllables are rendered. While the Zwettl manuscript generally preserved the full range of quality in Old High German vowels, Unternam, Bistum, Bilo, Missiniuzo, Guntreba, Suri, Huskonosono, Skuntari, Snellir, Zeltari, Satalpogo. The Munich manuscript writes the same terms with weakened syllables. The weakening of unstressed syllables to schwa is considered to be one of the most reliable linguistic criteria for distinguishing Old from Middle High German. In the last session, I pointed out how the Schreibsprachen, or written dialects of Middle High German, are far from standardized. In the case of the Salomon glossary, this means that in the 12th century, when glosses were copied, there was no binding norm that would prescribe the use of modern linguistic forms, i.e. forms with weakened, unstressed syllables. What the scribes' precise motives were is not clear, but we must assume that both approaches, conservative and modernizing, fulfilled communicative functions. Let us now return to the textual tradition in the proper sense. I'd like to start with an example from religious practice. The 11th and early 12th centuries are characterized by a changed relationship between the individual and the world. Gisela Vollmann-Profe has spoken of a new subjectivism in the religious sphere. The Christian faith comes to be experienced personally and subjectively, no longer just as a duty ordered from above. Typical of this changed understanding are, for example, the early Middle High German laments for sin, which are kept in an individual tone and take the place of the older formal confessions. Religious edification is combined with aesthetic standards. A textual comparison should make this clear. The confession of having sinned against the law of chastity appears in the Old High German Lorsch confession from the 9th century within a list-like series among numerous other conceivable transgressions. I read it. Ich Giunides, abundstes, bis brachas, verienes, firinlustio, citio forlasenero, Ubarnudi, Geilis, Lav heti tragi, Gottes ambachtes, huoro vileno, farligero, intimordes, intimanslachta, ubarasi, ubartrunci. Don't do it. Several early Middle High German confessions come in verse form, which are sometimes considerable in scope and contain self-accusation of these same transgressions. But there's a difference. They are more personal, so to speak. The following excerpt from the 12th century Furor Lamentation for Sin addresses the sins of slander, theft, and fornication, and it reads as follows. The equivalent to the Lorsch confession are in red on the right. I'll just flip through these quickly and come back to a few examples afterwards. Even if the Furor Lamentation contains most of the same sins found in the Lorsch confession, it is a far cry from the early medieval confessional formula which underpins the latter. The changes we see are not mere idiosyncrasy, but rather a traceable development of the textual type. The traditional prose form is replaced by andrhyme. Above all, however, the departure from the Carolingian formularies seems to allow a focus on a subject aware of his sins, not the accumulation of pronouns in the first person singular throughout. In blue, wahre Gott durch dine Gurte, nu vernimm rüwigen mich, ich will mich ruhigen wider dich, ich bin's, der wirseste Mann, and so on. And where the Lorsch confession simply states, Ich gü niedes, I confess to envy, the Vortext elaborates it in a far more tangible manner. Dem ich wohl zusprach, ich ne verließ es nie durch das, ich nerjete immer ansehen gut. At a superficial glance, one might get the idea that the linguistic differences between the large confession and the four lamentation are due to the fact that the former is written in prose, while the latter is written in rhyming couplet verse. A look at the theological treatise literature of the early Middle High German period shows, however, that a prose-verse dichotomy only tells half the story. In the 12th century, a translation of 9 chapters from Alcuin's treatise De Virtutibus Evitiis was produced in the Augustinian monastery of Indersdorf in Upper Bavaria, which is now part of the composite manuscript unit Bayerische Staatsbibliothek CLM 7636. Researchers have rightly emphasized linguistic autonomy of the translation compared to the Latin original. Here are just 3 examples. Until the late Middle Ages, attempts to imitate the Latin gerundive can be found in numerous vernacular sources, but not here. Instead of rendering the sequence primum omnium querendum homini est as vor allen Dingen zu erforschene ist, where the gerundive querendum corresponds to the inflected German infinitive zu erforschene, the 12th century translator paraphrases using the preterite present verb sollen, which results in vor allen Dingen soll Männische erforschen, above all man should investigate. Second example, unlike German, Latin does not have articles to indicate whether a piece of information is known or new. Accordingly, in early translations from Latin into German, the use of articles is a good and high-frequency criterion to measure the autonomy of the translation. Instead of rendering the Latin sentence Sapientia huius mundi stultitia est apodeum, word for word, into early Middle High German, which would result in Wiesheit der Werte ist Tumpheit vor Gotte, we find a translation that feels familiar to modern German speakers. The definite article du marks what is spoken about, the subject, a known entity. The indefinite article ein marks the new information assigned to this subject. Du Wiesheit der Werte ist ein Tumpheit vor Gotte. And third example, even though we will see in a moment that the Alcuin translation by no means shies away from complex syntax, it shows itself to be quite flexible in the adoption of certain syntactic structures compared to the Latin original. For example, it would have been no problem to translate the causal subordinate clause quia in his duobus vita beata acquiritur with wandte in diesen Zevern Dingen wird der ewige Lieb gewonnen. The translator of Alcuin's treatise, however, decides against the syntactical expression of the causal relationship and instead chooses a lexical solution, the adverb so. In diesen Zevern Dingen so wird der ewige Lieb gewonnen. Apart from the latter passage, however, the translation makes full use of the possibilities of syntactic subordination, as I will show now with the chapter De Sapientia. I'll read it first. Vor allen Dingen soll Männische erforschen, welchu siege du wahre Gewissida, unde du wahre Wiesheit, wandte du Wiesheit der Welte ist ein Tumpheit vor Gotte. Du wahre Gewissede ist du wahre Gewissete ist, dass du dich bekehrest von den Sundton, die des Teufels jenes sind, unter du wahre Wiesheit ist, dass du Gott ubest nach der Wahrheit seiner Gebote and so on. Here we have independent sentences connected by logical, in this case causal conjunctions, e.g. wandte and wann. We also have syntactic subordination. Du wahre Gewissete ist, dass du dich bekehrest von den Sundton, die des Teufels jenes sind. Und die wahre Wiesheit ist, dass du Gott ubest nach der Wahrheit seiner Gebote. Despite its relative complexity, the construction is clearly transparent as it does not go beyond second-degree subordination. In addition to such prose texts, sources survive from the 11th and 12th centuries that do not consistently exploit the systematic possibilities of early Middle High German syntax. These are usually poetic texts employing end rhyme. I will discuss the case with an example that is prominent in literary history, the early Middle High German Etzolied. The Etzolied is considered to be the first vernacular poem after the revival of tradition in the middle of the 11th century. It has survived in an older, shorter version from Strasbourg around 1130 and a longer, younger version from Furau, 12th to 13th century. The Strasbourg manuscript actually comes from Ochsenhausen near Memmingen in the Allgäu. Furau was a canon monastery and Ochsenhausen a Benedictine monastery that had joined the Hirsau reform movement. According to the prologue of the Furau manuscript, the song was written by a man named Etzo at the suggestion of Bishop Gunther von Bamberg and set to music by a man named Wille. Der gute Bischof Gunther von Babenberg, der hieß machen ein viel gut Werche, hieß die Sine Pfaffen ein gut Lied machen. Eines Liedes sie begunden, wann sie die Burgkunden, etzo begunde schrieben, Wille fand die Wiese. There is nothing unusual about this statement insofar as the written tradition is still located in the domain of clerical writing culture. As was the case in the early Middle Ages, a precise knowledge of the Bible is a prerequisite for poetic activity. The choice of the vernacular is unusual, but is not explicitly justified here. The situation is different in another contemporary source, this time in Latin, which mentions Etzo and his poetic activity. This is the Vita Altmanni, the biography of Bishop Altmann von Passau. The following passage deals with the year 1065. Eo tempore, quo terrore per moti non solum vulgaris, sed et populum primoris, genere et dignitate insignis, et ipsi diversarum civitatum episcopi, magna gloria et summo honero fulti, patriam cognatus et divitias reliquerunt, et per atam viam crucem baiolantis Christum secuti sunt. Quorum praevius dux et incentur fuit Guntherus Babinbergensis episcopus, virtam corporis elegantia quam animi sapientia conspicuus. In cuius comitatum multi nominati viri et clerici et laeci tam de orientali Francia quam de Bavaria fuerunt, inter quos praecipui duo canonici extiterunt videlicet etzo scholasticus vir omni sapientia et eloquentia praeditus, qui in eodem itinere cantilineam de miraculis Christi patria lingua nobilita composuit. Etzo scholasticus could well have been a clergyman, mentioned several times in Bamberg documents. The Wille, who was mentioned in the prologue, was possibly the later abbot of the Michelsberg monastery in Bamberg. However, the song was probably not composed ad hoc during the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, as is mentioned in the source, but at some point beforehand. The subject matter is world history, which is interpreted as the history... Sorry.
The translation so that we
Sorry. Where was I? I restart with the subject matter. Well, the subject matter of this text is world history, which is interpreted as the history of salvation. From the beginning, Christ was destined to be the Redeemer. At the end of time, he will bring the righteous into his kingdom. Christ is first the God who existed before his incarnation, then the man who lives on earth, then the ruler of heaven, earth, and hell. For the people, he is the Redeemer, the mediator to God, and victor over the devil. Following Pope Gregory the Great, the victory over the devil is interpreted as pia fraus, a pious fraud. See this in the text. Von Holze huob sich der Tod, von Holze gefiel Gotte Lob. Der Tier verginite an das Fleisch, der Angel, was die Gottheit, nu ist es wohl ergangen, daran ward gefangen. In the fight against the devil, however, Christ is also the commander, the Herzoge in German. The believers are his servants. Etzo came up with all the images and patterns of interpretation for the biblical motives mentioned in the theological tradition. The structure of the song is a chronological narrative, but there are explanatory passages inserted as well as invocations and prayer-like sections which, again, result from the more individual piety of the time which I mentioned earlier. The most comprehensive study on the language of the Etzo-Lied to date was published almost a century ago by Helmut de Boer in the 1920s. I will concentrate here on his observations on syntax, which will then be contrasted briefly with our findings on the syntax of the Alcuin translation, which I mentioned earlier. When it comes to linking sentences, it is not subordination but coordination that dominates in the Etzo-Lied. There are basically three possibilities here. Firstly, a syndeton, i.e. a simply sequence with no conjunction between terms. Secondly, expressions with logical relationships marked with conjunction. And finally, anaphora, where a connection is made by repeating an earlier constituent. There is some overlap between options 2 and 3 here. The only thing that stands out in the Etzo-Lied is that the first possibility, the asyndetic sequence, is very common. Just take another look at the passage we've just seen. Von Holze, Hurb sich der Tod, etc. Each line is its own independent main clause. Only the last line, daran ward gefangen, shows anaphoric connection with da. Linking with do is also quite characteristic of the star, as you see in the second example. Duor begieng hebräisken Sitte, duor ward circumcisus, duor nannten sie ihn Jesus. This do, or here duor, has lost its original local meaning and has become a linking particle. Linking sentences with do is the most common form of anaphora we observe in the Etzo-Lied. However, there are structures consisting of main and subordinate clauses that become confusing, convoluted clauses, the structure of which is difficult to understand, as in this example. Dur erskinen an dere Werte, die Sternen bereziten, die der Philutze liechtes waren, first degree relative clause, so berchte sie wohl waren, wandte sie beschatte wote, a second degree causal clause, die Nebel finster Nacht, du von dem Tüjefel bekom, third degree relative clause, indes gewählte wir alle waren, fourth degree relative clause, und zu uns erscheint des Gottes Sohn, fifth degree temporal clause, wahrer Sono von den Himmelen. De Boer speaks of extensive sentence systems which had not yet visibly been mastered from a linguistic perspective, which, as he continues, must be regarded as the first attempt to reproduce the extensive branching constructions of Latin. This example already shows that the dominant types of subordination clauses and relative clauses and das clauses. Relative clauses would be die der Philutze liechtes waren related to Stern and stars, du von dem Tüfel bekorn related to Nacht, night. Overall, the syntax of the Etzo-Lied, and by extension of the entirety of the early Middle High German poetic corpus, is home to only a few complex sentences, i.e. syntactic structures made up of a main clause and a subordinate clause or subordinate clauses. In keeping with this, conjunctions that express logical relationships are quite rare. Conjunction das is still most common, but it is semantically the weakest. Das connects main and subordinate clauses that have very different logical relationships to one another. It is similar to anaphora. The most common anaphoric element is do or duo. As a rule of thumb, one line of verse equates to one sentence. and the sentence and the material to be communicated are one and the same. Oratorical embellishment is still quite rare here. More than half of the Etzelied consist of single-line sentences. The sequence of simple sentences is often further emphasized through parallelism. As you see here, von den Wurzeln gab immer die Adern, von dem Grase gab immer das Haar, von dem Meere gab immer das Blut, von den Wolken das Murt. Finally, it is crucial to emphasize that the contemporary low complexity of the syntax of the Etzelied must by no means be misunderstood as a symptom of a deficient linguistic system. The analysis of Alcuin's treatise had made it clear what possibilities existed here even in the 11th and 12th centuries. If the syntax of the Etzelied rarely makes use of these possibilities, this is a result of conscious stylistic choice and not a sign of linguistic weakness, so to speak. This impression is confirmed by the care the scribe of the Etzelied took with punctuation in the Vorau manuscript. As Nigel Palmer and recently Norbert Kössinger have shown, the punctuation system of the Vorau Etzelied is based on the so-called positure. What does it mean? We take a look at the second stanza of the Etzelied, for example. 3 punctuation marks can be distinguished. The punctus, which marks either a pause or the end of the verse, the punctus versus, which indicates the end of a sententia, and finally the punctus elevatus, which marks the end of a self-contained sense unit within such a sententia. Ich will eben allen Punctus eine viel wahre Rede vortun, Punctus, von dem minen Sinne, Punctus, von dem rechten Annegänge, Punctus elevatus, von den Gnaden also mannigfalt. Well, there should be a punctus, but there isn't any. Die uns us den Buchen sind gezahlt, Punctus, usa genesi und us libro regum, der Welt all zur Gnaden, Punctus versus. I hope you can see the different forms of the punctuation marks on the slides. The punctuation in this manuscript thus serves neither the notation of metrical units nor the representation of syntactical structures, but functions as an aid to reading aloud and having a better grasp of contextual relationships. The fact that the vernacular hymn text in the Vorau manuscript seems to have been conceived specifically for recitation to an illiterate audience fits in well with some of the content-related accents that the Vorau manuscript has compared to the Strasbourg version. The narrator addresses a socially unspecified audience in the Vorau manuscript, ü eben allen, whereas it's the Lord's ü heron in Strasbourg manuscript. And the ultimate purpose of the text is salvation, zu Gnaden in the Vorau manuscript, whereas it's honor, die dien eron in the Strasbourg one, while Ehre being one of the cardinal virtues of medieval nobility. We will now move on from examples showing how early Middle High German speakers and writers used their language. We are unfortunately ill-informed about what speakers of early Middle High German thought about early Middle High German, even compared to Old High German or Classical and Late Middle High German, with one notable exception. The author of the so-called Old German or Vienna Genesis, which probably originated around 1060, 1080, today's Austria, tells a very vivid version of the creation story, especially when it comes to the creation of man and the senses. Firstly, it says, tät an dem Antlutze 7 Locher nutze, 2 an den Ohren, dass mugge horen. Joch 2 Augen, dass er sehe dir getaugen, 2 an der Nase, dass er stinken mugge in dem Munde eines, so nutzte nicht der Reines. What then follows is the first surviving attempt in German to describe the articulatory production of speech sounds, although there are of course numerous models, especially from the Latin tradition, which the author might have used as a guide. In dem Munde hieß er hangen eine Zungenlange, fuhre dir ihlte er machen einen Kinnebachen, Zahne 2 Gefährte, Beinen viele Härte, dass sie das Essen brechen und dass du Zunge spreche. Svenne sie den Wind fahet und in den Mund zuhet, an den Zahnen sie schöpfet das Wort, das sie spricht. Well, this brings us to the end of this rough overview of the early Middle High German textual types and their transmission. I'll sum up the main points again. At the beginning of the early Middle High German period, i.e. around the middle of the 11th century, writing was still not yet prominent amongst lay culture. But in the course of the early Middle High German period, i.e. from the middle of the 11th century to the third quarter of the 12th century, a lay audience gradually emerged. This audience was served by spiritual authors in 2 major areas of writing. Firstly, poetic text, and secondly, with text and glosses, of course, on religious practice and instruction. A large part of the early Middle High German corpus is an intersection of both of these by being poetic and religiously instructive. Of course, linguistic communication also took place outside the religious domain in the 11th and 12th centuries, but little or nothing has survived from everyday usage. This also applies to the traditional forms of poetry, the medium of self-assurance of the illiterate early medieval warrior nobility. We know through indirect evidence that these traditions were continued orally, but none of this made it onto parchment. What was not literature of sufficient interest to clerical circles. Finally, what is still missing in the first phase of early Middle High German is literature of secular practice. We only have sparse remnants of legal texts and no actual documents, no private records, no court files or other texts that are close to everyday life. What does this overview reveal for the possibilities of German language historiography in the 11th and 12th centuries? Again, only an excerpt of the reality of language is visible from the sources, and by no means the German that was spoken in all dimensions and contexts. We are dealing with texts from the religious sphere, except for sermons which were delivered in prose and mostly still in poetic stylization. On this basis, we can reconstruct the grammar of the time to a certain extent, the morphology of nouns, verbs, etc., because the existing corpus is so large that all grammatical categories and forms can be found at least somewhere. Phonetic developments that have taken place since Old High German can also be reconstructed on the basis of these texts. However, our understanding of the syntax is problematic, because on the one hand, stylistic practices in verse could come into conflict with natural word order. On the other hand, prose is consistently translation prose and frequently depends on Latin structures, even if there, as you have seen, some exceptions. The biggest gap is the vocabulary. Large area of everyday lexicon have never been put onto parchment, and this only changes fundamentally in the second half of the 13th century, which will be treated in a later lecture. That's it for today. Well, almost, because Henrike has to repeat her announcement from the start, but not everybody was there.
Many thanks. That was really a brilliant start for our term of the academic year. Also to all second years here in the room. We had several students before going to Trier and really enjoying their time there. So Nikolaus and I will hang around for a few more minutes. I'll do actually the year abroad briefing on Wednesday for the second year students. So if you are interested, for example, in lexicography, the big Middle High German dictionary is written in Trier, or in digital humanities. They have a brilliant center for digital scholarship in Trier. It's a really interesting option for either your whole year abroad to study at Trier University, or others have done it as a placement at the end after a British Council assistantship. And Trier is a very interesting area of Germany, near Luxembourg, with a proximity to France.
If you're interested in contact linguistics, for instance, this might be a place to go. Or even if there's some of you who study late antiquity, Trier was one of the centers of the world until the 3rd century, well, a long time ago, but there are early medieval manuscripts in the Stadtbibliothek still to be treated, so there's plenty of things to do.
So a short advertisement break for Trier. Also an advertisement for this lecture slot. So next week I'll be standing here again, but lecturing on something that I've built as a bridging lecture between the medieval period paper and the early modern period paper, because I think actually the overlap is particularly interesting, and to see a lot of the literary forms of the modern period evolving between 1400 and 1600, and actually to question slightly the periodization that we have in paper 4. And as I mentioned briefly before, I'll try to approach literary text through linguistic analysis as a kind of close reading and commentary. We'll start with a very colorful figure, Oswald von Wolkenstein, the first author to commission his own songbooks and having himself portrayed as you can see here, strong standing figure, not shy at all about his literary production, holding up a song bubble, Ein Anfang. So he's...
It seems he had a quite colorful life.
Also a Raubritter and all that, but also very influential. So you can follow songs of his to the student songbook, the Rostocker Liederbuch from the late 15th, early 16th century. So it would have been sung. He was based in current day Austria, but his songs were sung in Low German at the Baltic Sea in Rostock. They were also copied in early modern patrician songbooks in the towns of southern Germany. So you can really see a song culture developing. In week 4, I'll do a session on Reformation hymns, partly because on 5 November the Oxford Bach soloists are doing a concert based on Reformation hymns in New College, and since I translated their program, I've 6 complimentary tickets. Anybody who wants one and has been at the lecture will get one. And then we come to a topic that is very close to my own research. I'm currently editing letters and diaries of northern German nuns from the late 15th and 16th century, and try to argue that actually what was happening behind the walls of the convent was hugely influential for the development of vernacular singing. And we'll deal with some really fun parody songs they wrote about stupid clergy, and that links in a way to the later to then the final session with the nuns on the run, nuns leaving the convent. In week 6, I'll look at Philip Nicolai and other early Baroque poets and show how they link actually to medieval traditions of mysticism, and also pick up themes that the nuns had been discussing in their songs. And we'll have the guest lecture by Professor Julia Frick from Zurich in week 7, who is discussing a very curious case, which is quite useful as a kind of exam preparation. So it was a schoolmaster who tried to condense the whole Bible in 3 songs. So if you memorize these 3 songs, you have a short summary from Genesis to the Apocalypse. So a good investment in biblical knowledge. All right, so that's it for this week. As I said, we'll both hang around here for a bit of time. If you have questions on the lecture or on Trier, welcome to discuss it with Nikolaus.
Thank you. Bisschen Tourismus.
Yeah, definitely.